I really appreciate not only this lecture, but your work. And I think that it takes us forward in interesting ways. But there seems to be a danger, especially as first of all, and I appreciate how strongly you present your case and how you don't take, and you're not reluctant to take prisoners. But
they're all dead, you notice.
Yes.
Such a lovely human being.
But the danger is, are you actually abandoning sociology for psychology? It seems that or sociology becomes a kind of collective psychology, which some people make that argument, including Gabriel Todd. But I find something missing in this account. I mean, which sort of an aside comment, as an aside, in the subordinate phrase. I'm trying to remember. You said action, interaction. And, there's something that happens in social movements and social protests that emerges when these real human beings kind of dramatically face each other. That was not in the human beings to begin with, and actually changes the human beings. So I think if we use your desired, you're in favor of introspection. So those of us who've been involved in protest movements know that when you're involved, there's an elation and so emotion, and also an insight that occurs as a consequence of being together. The sociologists of the 50s thought that was delusional. Seems to me that you're actually recommending that, and I'm recommending to actually see the creativity in that. So, how do you avoid, this turn to the psychological seems to turn away from that which emerges when people face each other. And I'll just get, and then I say that, and thinking of Robin, I think the account of Goffman that you presented is wrong. That he doesn't analyze how people play pre-existing roles. He's as interested in how people actually write their roles as they're interacting with each other. They present themselves, but in presenting themselves, they actually become someone. So,
I think with Goffman, they are collaborating, right? There's an assumption that they help each other avoid shame.
Exactly. That's my point.
But there are also cases where there's an intentional shaming going on, right? Where the more conflictual.
The cynic in Goffman, the cynical side of Goffman.
I think you answered your own question in a way, and I think interaction is the answer. We want to avoid group mind kinds of models where somehow crowds take us over, and crowds force us to all think the same way, feel the same way. That it wasn't terribly interactive, those kinds of models, right? The only interaction really was between the demagogue and the followers he manipulated, right? So the crowd itself was this kind of inert mass with this group mind. I think today we can, thanks to a lot of the structuralists, Clark McPhail and people like that, we can break crowds apart and really see what goes on inside them. And it's interactions between people. They influence each other. There is that kind of excitement, that collective effervescence that Durkheim talked about very definitely. Randy Collins has done a good job of elaborating on that. And we can see how that works. There is such a thing as emotional contagion. Right? You see somebody smiling, you tend to smile. You tend to mimic their facial expression. If you smile, you tend to feel good. If you see them with an angry expression, you tend to do that, and you tend to feel angry. So there are these very micro, but interactional processes. So the psychology, the difference between what I'm arguing for in the 50s is nobody remembers the 50s, so we can trash them. They believe that the psychology started first. People were somehow angry and then went out in the streets. People had grievances and then found ways to mobilize themselves. People were, in the Freudian traditions, people were narcissistic or so on, and they would want to be, they had unresolved edible complexes. So that sort of came first, and that determined most of what happened. Or they formed a crowd, and then suddenly the crowd was available as a crowd to do whatever the leader wanted. I think what emotions show us is, the study of emotions, that really it's the interactions that give us the emotions, right? We don't have emotions just sitting there, seething at home. Although read some of the Tea Party stuff, you might think that people are just sitting there at home, furious, go off to town hall meetings and so on. So I don't think it's psychology in that sense, but it's psychological in that we have to understand what's going on inside our bodies. And it's not. Psychology tends to be more universalizing, right, and less cultural. I think, right, because we get all these cultural cues. Emotions are contrary to one psychological theory, at least, a very popular one. Most of emotions are cultural. What triggers emotions is culturally determined. How we express those emotions is culturally determined. The labels we put on them are cultural. And the only thing that's not very cultural is our ability to have certain hormones, have certain muscles. We have certain muscles. That's not terribly cultural. Using certain muscles in the displays is cultural. So that's where real psychology tends not to get these kinds of interactive cultural dynamics, I think. So I think it's very sociological because it's interactive. And although I also think there are individuals and actions, and they think up things, and they're creative, and sort of partly independently of real interactions, or before and after interactions, so that there's a long series of actions and interactions. And interactionism doesn't get it all, but it's certainly my main framework, I would say.
Yeah, I that's a good answer.
What I'm going to do is going to be a little bit unpolite, I think. But, so you started your talk by saying that social movement literature is kind of dull because it has abandoned humans. And you're going to reintroduce humans into social movement literature. But so if I just
I didn't say I was going to do that. I'm encouraging you to do that, actually.
If I go through the keywords of your talk of what we heard about strategy and resources and players and arenas and individuals and emotions, but I'm still kind of missing the humans. So I'm wondering, and we kind of live in a protest age again, right? From Occupy Wall Street to the Middle East to Thailand or to the Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us some empirical examples of how this model would work, how you would have us understand what's going on today a little bit better.
Let me give you an abstract answer and then a concrete answer. I do write about individuals. I don't write biographies, but I do try to have real people in the stuff that I write about protest. And yes, they are the vignettes that open chapters very often, but I try to make sure that they come back in the chapters and what they do really matters in what I say in the chapters in ways that standard sociological writing really drops them. As Evan said, I'm actually the editor of 2 different book series, and I would say one of the most common mistake sociologists make when they try to write for a broader audience is that they add these vignettes at the beginning of the book. There are 2 or 3 or 4 people, and then you never see the people again. Right? They disappear. And some of those books get published. Not in my series, but some of those books get published. And I think, so they have to matter in ways such that they come back in the rest of the chapter, the rest of the book, and so on. They're not just window dressing to draw on the reader because somebody said, read Clifford Geertz's essays. He always has this great hook at the beginning, and it's an individual in person. And so we were all taught, this is a way to write well. Concrete examples, a little harder. The Arab Spring. Mohammed Bouazizi kills himself. Nobody's ever heard of him before. He becomes a great symbol of resistance, frustration, outrage at petty corruption of dictatorial regimes. Now, he matters, in ways that could allow us to talk about individuals. He never made any strategic decisions that we know of, other than the big one. He was not a leader. He was only important after he died. Now, this suggests to me that you can think about individuals as in their full complexity in a couple ways. Some individuals matter because they are leaders and they make choices that matter for other people. They're I call them decisive individuals. I don't like the term leaders, really, because there's such an aura of leadership, especially in the U.S., thanks to the world of business and military. There's this cult of leadership. There's the individuals. So they're individuals who matter because they make decisions, other people follow them or obey the decisions, and so on, and there's a whole long sequence. Other individuals are important because they are good to think with, and other people use them as symbols. They may not have any decision-making power. In fact, martyrs are great examples because once they're dead, they have no control over their reputation. Other people can use those reputations. But they're great symbols. So Bouazizi was a fabulous symbol, as martyrs often are. There were imitators in Tunisia and elsewhere. He inspired lots of people in the Arab Spring. So he mattered, and his story matters. Getting his story right doesn't really matter, because what matters is how people saw him and what he became a symbol of. But we need individuals as symbols. We need the Bouazizis and the Rosa Parks and people like that. Now, they're different from analyzing, say, Martin Luther King Jr. or Morsi's. Those are decision makers, right? What we need to understand why they make the decisions they do as well, in order to understand outcomes, seems to me. Right? Decisions matter, strategies matter, the choices matter. So that's an example of an individual who mattered in a certain way, in a symbolic way.
This is not a question. I'm sorry. We're just following on that. Can I just a second?
I was going to say,
the same. Go ahead.
About Bouazizi and setting yourself on fire is not a rare thing for the Middle Eastern context. I'm from there, I know. And there's been a lot of cases like that when I was growing up, and I was seeing those things on the TV channels and they were also going somehow viral. I mean, not in this age viral, but somehow viral. But none of them had this, fire ignition. They didn't trigger something like that before. I mean, and what is strategy here then? If it's not really if it's really the human and the protester and its agenda or the strategy, where's the context then? Because for the Mohammed Bouazizi's case, it was the video. The video became so viral, everyone was exposed to it, and that the moment of truth, because you see someone hurting himself in such a way that, and the cause is such a silly and simple cause for him. I mean, he wanted to sell his stuff freely without being bothered by the police or whatever. I mean, where does the context,
Well, you're right. It's very hard to predict what image, what video, what individual is going to be taken up that way, right? If you set out to design, a video or an incident that was going to go viral, there's no way you could do it, right? So, I think there's a sort of natural selection process there. Some do, some don't. You think of all the police pepper gas sprayings that go on, right? Any number of which get caught on video, increasing numbers certainly. Some of them go viral, some of them don't. So the UC Davis incident became huge. And then you can, after the fact, you can go and you can say, well, if the protesters have already been subdued, they're sitting there passively. The coldness of this police chief, I think it was the UC Davis head of police, right? Just kind of walking along systematically, spraying them in this systematic, unemotional way, right? Is more chilling. I mean, you can do that, but you can't predict. What you can predict is if you have 1,000 videos of police doing pepper sprays, you're more likely to get one that goes viral than if you have 5 or 10 or 1 or none. And that's happened in the past. So, but it still mattered with the particular configuration of meanings in that particular video matter, right? Some go viral, some don't. And the infrastructure needs to be there, certainly. But, that infrastructure could make all sorts of different ones go viral, and it doesn't, and certain ones do. That's the kind of real individual level stuff we really need to think about and tease out, I think.
It was connected and it's already disconnected, but I was wondering, listening to you also, thinking about examples and in understanding the nature of the protests actually in North Africa and during Arab Spring, whether that kind of human beings that actually triggered Bouazizi was one, but actually in each of those countries, right? So in Egypt there was this guy, student, who was pulled out from the cybernet cafe and murdered, and that went viral, right? In Syria, those were kids who were arrested and because they did graffiti, right? And in Libya, there was a lawyer, human rights lawyer. So suddenly those images emerged, and I'm just wondering to what extent the symbolism of that kind of moment that you say contextual kind of coexistence, right? The coincidence of the right moment, larger constellation, political constellation in the region, but also the kind of the individual which is being lifted and the kind of symbolism of that did not had a very perhaps important effect on the nature of those movements, which became like leaderless. So we do have that individual who has, there are stories around it, and the incredible mobilization, really mass mobilization, because there is this anger and related to humiliation, and then yet we have those movements in which actually there are no leaders, and those movements are therefore, in a strange way, incapacitated in a certain way vis-à-vis the leaders like. You mentioned people who thought and who were able to communicate and then maybe negotiate or start negotiating, like Havel, for example, who was both the thinker and the martyr, so to speak, except he became the president later on. But I'm thinking about it, whether there was a way of engaging your... I found it very interesting, and I'm very much into it because I'm trying to understand the nature of public happiness. What is it? What does it count? What is it constitute? And then the thing is just emotions. It's much more than that. So I'm with it, and I don't think it's so psychological. What is psychological? I don't do because I don't understand. I don't know about it. But I think that there are ways of using what you are suggesting to kind of understand things which are difficult to understand. Maybe they are actually difficult to approach. In other words, you just suggested something that if we. I think it's just mostly inspirational. I think it's something to inspire, to get rid of one's own limitations and kind of walls that we build that you cannot do that, or this is not right theory and that's not trendy or whatever. That that it allows you to imagine things differently or anew. It's kind of right, and frees you from all that stuff, while maybe at the same time remembering in the back of your head is that there was your time and there were things said before, right, and explain things which are kind of happening in front of our eyes, and we cannot, there is no how, we cannot explain it, we just don't understand that. That was the question. It was just too long. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there are. I don't want to abandon the factors, the mechanisms that matter in the more structural paradigm. Certainly, infrastructure. Matters that there's an internet out there. Mm-hmm. Communications technologies matter. The fact that police have tear gas or pepper gas spray and so on. These things matter. But then it also matters, why do they decide to use them when they do? I mean, it's some police commander, maybe it's not. Maybe it's some guy in the street who's disobeying the orders from up above. We need to recognize those idiosyncrasies, I think.
The questions?
I
have a question that is more about the methodological approach. Because what I like about the interactionist approach is that it also acknowledges that I am an individual as a researcher interacting with individuals. But at the same time, I am also an individual with emotions that might choose to observe certain interactions than others. So I'm just trying to figure out how then this approach might bring me closer to my subject and not distance it by my own limitations as an individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Two things. I think it's a really good question, because I do believe that this strategy and emotions matters for everybody. It's not just protesters, obviously. The more we are aware of our own emotions as researchers, the more we can take them into account, right? Because very often, what qualitative research, or at least with interviews, ethnography, and so on, what really matters is we're aware of our effect on the setting. We're aware of our effect on the person we're interviewing, and we can sort of compensate mentally or try to adjust it in some way, right? And so the more we're aware of our emotions, I think the better we can be as researchers. But I would also say, from a strategic point of view, a lot of work on sort of standard teaching about how to interview people says, well, you've got to get rid of all these barriers to communication and understand, and at least be aware, not be aware of status differences and so on. But what they don't say usually is to be aware of your strategic project and their strategic interests in the interview. Right? People you're interviewing have a reason to be there. They have motives. They have goals for that interview. Their goal is not to help you understand what you're studying. Their goal is to make a point, to badmouth a bad boss, to say something that may get back to other people you interview, to make a point that may get published someday. I mean, they have all sorts of strategic projects, and when you get taught about interviewing, you don't really get taught about that very much, I think. Then you have your own interviews, and your methods get taught in this way as though graduate students were infants, I think. And so, you're told, in all these texts, well, I've got to be very careful to get the permission for informed consent, and you've got to be careful to protect the person you're interviewing and everything, all of which is morally right. But they never say, well, there's a trade-off there. Right? All of this stuff is going to mean you get less information, or you might not get information. You might not be able to use certain information. So there's a real world out there of dilemmas. Some of them are moral, and some of them are more practical. But those disappear in methodological textbooks and prescriptions, where they just tell you what you should do, and not the reality of the costs and so on of doing the right thing. Often, if that makes sense. So that I think both emotions and strategy are dimensions of our research interactions, just as much as they are of protest interactions.
I have a question.
So, if this combination of approaches, yoking strategy and emotion together, assessing the humanity, the personhood of the protesters and others, is not prospective. In other words, if it's not predictive, all right, and the goal of it is not to predict or be prospective, because there's this capacity to be surprised, etc. And if it's often a retrospective understanding of a martyr who gets taken up or whatever, and others who don't. And yet, so you have prospection, you have retrospection, but you really lean on introspection, okay? So what's the temporality of introspection?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are two, right? One is more or less the present, right? I mean, although the present is pretty, so it becomes retrospective. But you can, I think we should do a lot more as sociologists with diary methods, so that you get people who are involved in whatever it is to keep diaries. Now, obviously they're writing it down after something has happened, but it's pretty fresh. So they can keep a diary over 6 months of an occupation, or usually it lasts that long, a month of an occupation, that is pretty, you wouldn't really want to call it retrospective because they're doing it during the occupation, and that's influencing how they feel and think about what they're doing while they're doing it, essentially. So a lot of emotion research, or some emotion research, uses these diaries at the end of every day. People write about the emotions they had, the interactions they had, but then they go back the next day and have interactions that are based on that day's interactions. So it's, it ends up being, not as quite as simultaneous as but it's introspection is retrospection for the most part, right? We are thinking about, when I was any nuclear protester, what kinds of things did I feel and do and think and so on. So I think most of it is retrospective that way.
Right.
The other thing, though, if you want prospective, I don't think any sociologist really does much very good predictive, or maybe demographers, although even they are not particularly good at it. But there's sort of a practical element to this approach, that we become better advisors in a way to people we're working with. And protesters often are happy to get advice. We never know as much as the protesters themselves about the complexity of the situation, but we can say, often. So I have, for example, one of the strategic dilemmas I've written a lot about is naughty or nice. Do you follow the rules, play by the game, or are you aggressive? Do you break rules, or you push? So with something like that, you could describe what other movements have done facing that situation, or when naughty is likely to win and when it's likely to lose. So, you don't want you want to be aggressive. If you ever want to be aggressive, if you don't rule it out for moral reasons, you want to be aggressive when there's something to win that's important and irreversible. Right? You don't want to lose that public reputation or bring the authorities down on you for something that's fairly trivial or easily reversed later on. Right? So a union, will do something to be recognized as a union, which is less reversible than a lot of things it might do for its members and so on. So I think we have more of an ability than to be inside the flow of action and decision making. Now, this is not something I do much because I think we actually are not very good as advisors to protesters, but it's a possibility. But you're right, introspection is usually retrospection.
Yes, my question, it may deviate from your lens, which focuses on the relationship between the human and the activist. But what role do you think the authority as a human plays in this entire structure? Because I think a lot of times we forget that we're human with the symbols and everything that we see, and how groups react to humans with authority, with power structures.
Absolutely. I think, well, protest wouldn't be there if we weren't reacting to some action that has been taken, right? In order to blame somebody, you have to think of it as an action, not as just a state of nature, right? So usually it's either authorities, it's the state, or it's corporations or some other targets, but they have to do something that we think is morally wrong, right? So strategic action starts with their action usually, and then we're reacting to it. But even more, the sort of dance between protesters and the police, the police decisions matter, at least as much as the protesters' decisions. They're the ones who initiate violence inevitably. They're the ones who make choices that protesters then respond to, or do really awful things that make protesters even more angry and more able to mobilize people. So you don't have revolutions unless you have dictators with certain kinds of armies that, in fact, are fairly nasty, and otherwise you don't really have the grievances.
But their emotions may not. I'm not sort of disagreeing with you, but their emotions, the emotions of authority figures, may not necessarily represent the actions that they do. I mean, if you were to conduct a study on the emotions of authority, they may not be happy with the role they're given, or what they're supposed to do, or how they're reacting to activists.
Yeah, well, they're a compound player, just like a social movement or an organization is. So there will be complexities in that. The mayor, say, of a city may send some directive down to the police commissioner, who may send some directive down to the white shirts officers and command. That may or may not get there intact, sort of game of telephone. They still have emotions, just as the mayor has emotions, or whoever is making decisions. In fact, the problem is that police are not as accountable to elected officials as we would like them. So it's usually a police commander, commissioner, who's making decisions and has all sorts of emotions that are helping him or her define the role, right? So there's no way. It's very hard to imagine even a situation outside of emotions altogether, right? Even the supposed emotionlessness of a bureaucracy is a very elaborate construction that requires certain emotions. If that makes sense.
Can I just say something to this?
Last
If there are questions, I don't want
Carlos, yeah.
I was wondering if in all your scheme, how does ethics plays a role? Because you were mentioning how emotions and strategy, along with the body and morality, tend to shape, in a sense, a person, an individual, an organization, maybe in that sense. But I guess sometimes morality can be seen as like the official idea of how society thinks about certain things. And I would think that maybe the ethical part is the one that allows people to kind of counteract that, or trying to look things in a different way. So I was wondering if that was like kind of immersive, the emotional part, or would it also be something that plays a role, like what you were calling about naughtiness and that situation?
I don't really distinguish ethical and moral the way a lot of people do. I mean, for me, it has a kind of structural, functional origin, I think, almost, or feel to it, where morality consists of values and ethics consist of norms and roles and so on. It's sort of an application of the values, and it's a framework I don't really buy. So if I say, when I say moral, I mean anything that is sort of binding, we claims that we find binding, we hope are binding on others. So I don't really see a difference between ethical and moral, really. But I mean, the way in which it works is we have a variety of emotions, right? We might be afraid of breaking the norms and the rules. Simply, we're afraid we'll get punished. Right? A very simple, straightforward reason that people behave morally sometimes. But it is a fear, it's an anxiety about doing the wrong thing. We're often anxious that we'll do the wrong thing, not because we'll get punished, but because we'll feel bad. We'll look bad in our eyes and other people's eyes. So there's often a kind of relief when we do the right thing, right? And there's a pride when we do something downright heroic, which is rare, but people do it, and they're very proud of that. After doing the right thing feels really good, and I think that's a major motivation for protest, but other people, for other fields as well.